and moral superiority, but intellectual superiority is right there. In other words, I think Richard Hofstadter famously said that when he's thinking about conservatives, he couldn't think of any idea worth even mentioning. And it was like so far beneath their intellectual level. The only people who were doing any thinking worth considering was the left, and this was the Jewish left, basically.
Well, so there was a social science with a political agenda. Any scientific value at all, or basically a lot of smoke and mirrors?
Well, I wrote a whole long chapter on the authoritarian personality, and I think it's completely muddle-headed. And psychologists from day one, I mean, one of the most interesting things about this is if you go back into the 50s, right after it was published, you had well-known, very, competent psychologists saying, looking at these scales don't make any sense. Well, there's nothing here, but it didn't matter. You see that, and that's the thing about psychoanalysis too. If you go back, you can find guys in around 1912 say, "Where's the evidence? Where's the data?"
Well, same thing with Freud, of course.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Psychoanalysis, that there was no data for the Oedipal complex, nothing, and so they went for 100 years without feeling any need to come up with any data. It's one of that is one of the most amazing stories in science, in the history of science, that you have this movement that retains its momentum. This huge influence in the media. Think of all the movies that were made in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that were psychoanalytic in inspiration.
Well, it fits a pattern that you describe in your book, and that is a lot of these Jewish movies, they have one person who's charismatic, and he's authoritarian, and all the disciples treat him like a god. Am I right? Am I paraphrasing?
That's exactly right.
And that's happened with Freud, Marx, maybe not Marx, but a lot of the subsequent
Marx would try too, but yeah, Boas had this coterie of people who just worshipped him. I mean, from their point of view, he was the most important intellectual ever, period. I mean, Aristotle take a back seat.
How did Judaism in general and Zionism and all the other things escape this sort of scrutiny as far as it being also ethnocentric, which they were at one point decrying among Gentiles, but apparently looking the other way when it came to Jews? How do they manage that intellectual feat?
And we're still seeing that, aren't we? I mean, that is another one of the major stories here, that when it comes to ethnocentrism, we are constantly being told. I mean, if you look at the authoritarian personality, it's a fascinating example. They're talking. They interview someone, and he says, "I don't like Jews," or something like that. But they never talk about Jewish ethnocentrism. I mean, there's a whole...
They don't talk about Jewish ethnocentrism?
They get a 900-page book, and there's not one mention of Jewish ethnocentrism.
Only Gentiles.
Jewish ethnocentrism, is the only thing that really kept them together for 3,000 years or whatever. If you look at the vanguard, the settler movement in Israel, a lot of overtly very racialist stuff. We are superior. Non-Jews are like animals compared to us.
What is this, the Talmud or something, or later?
I'm talking about the settlers. I mean, there's a lot of these people right now
in Israel.
Yeah, in Israel, that these people have these ideologies. Well, but the ethnocentrism is palpable.
It's
right there.
It's buried. Now I want to move on to the literary world. Another Jewish intellectual movement. Cultural movement, let's say, literary, and that is the New York intellectuals. Now, who were they? When was their heyday, and are they still with us?
Well, they are with us in a sense. I think the heyday was I'd say from the late 1930s through the 50s. You had journals like the Partisan Review, and you had edited by Philip Roth and Rob and Philip, and these people.
Philip Roth, and name some others.
No, well, I'm not saying. No, his name was Rob, R-A-H-P, that was the center of it. But it was extremely prestigious. This was not; these people did not have PhDs necessarily, but it grew up to have this incredible prestige and a really big influence in the literary world. And
does it fit that pattern where you have a handful of glorified people with a kind of coterie of
You certainly have this strong sort of ethnic networking. Where people are pushing each other. People like. Seymour Martin Lipset was a sociologist. You had Clement Greenberg, the art critic. You had, and there's sort of second generation people like Saul Bellow. And see the influence now, because these people became anti-Stalinist left. The other thing that we sort of forget here is that even though most Jews, say in the 30s, 40s, 50s, on the left were with the Stalinist, left, but you had a very robust anti-Stalinist left, and they became more anti-Stalinist, although less so than
because
some.
anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness started to emerge.
I think that was a big part of
Union.
it, but certainly people started to be aware of the crimes of Stalin, and we became indefensible, really.
Yeah. Now, these movements have become fundamentally irrational. Some of these movements. That's what you said.
I think that, well, you look at psychoanalysis. What I'm saying, they're rational in the sense that they pose as science, but they're not. I mean, and that's a classic example. Or look at the authoritarian personality, the convoluted. These scales that don't make any sense. The fact that only right-wing conservative people can be prejudiced when you see these left-wing people who are obviously bigoted in various ways. So it became it was obviously a politically motivated program. You look at Boasian anthropology; it's the same kind of thing where it was like anti-science. It was like, we're not going to have any sort of systematic investigations of culture until we can completely get a theory, but they never got a theory. So you just have all these, infinitely variegated cultures, and they're sort of there, and that's the end of it. But you stop thinking in terms of trying to explain those cultural differences. What about genetic differences, for example? Not part of the game anymore.
Now I want to.
What about warfare? Not part of the game.
Now I want to move to more contemporary issues. Of course, we're at war right now. To what extent are Jewish interests? We already covered.
Well, I've just written a long thing
being
about
furthered by a war in Iraq. We're getting low on time.
Oh, we're getting low
on a 1 to 10.
Okay, well, the main thing is that this is the work of the neoconservative movement, and at the very center of the neoconservative movement, you have these very important think tanks. The American Enterprise Institute is perhaps the main one, but also the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. You have AIPAC, you have the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, but then you have the very important figures in the media, like Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard.
But what about even the mainstream, all the mainstream publications, from the New York Times down? Don't they kind of sanitize?
They certainly do. They certainly do.
And make acceptable the idea of Zionism, which is basically very much like what we once decried in South Africa. They kind of make it acceptable. I mean, is it that pervasive?
There's a consensus, but let's talk about neoconservatism. I think that the main influence of neoconservatism is within the Bush administration.
Right.
You have this support group of media, think tanks, and all that, but the main people are people like Paul Wolfowitz, Douglas Feith, Abrams, Elliot Abrams, Scholsky, and so on. In other words, these are the people who are pushing the policy
today. But let's face it, if it goes to the other side, we're going to see war coming from the Democrats. That's my last word.
Okay.
Kevin
I wouldn't doubt
MacDonald,
that.
We're out of time. It's been splendid having you with us, and I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Flashpoint.
I'd like to do